Can you hear me? Tell me through chat. Is it clear and loud? Have you had your dinner? Yes, I also have my dinner. Are you at home? I'm working from home. Hope that the internet connection at my home is stable. I try not go back to CityU campus because of the pandemic is serious. Half of the class will have seminar today. And I also have seminar today after the lecture. Have lesson until 10:20. Sometimes it overruns and it ends at 10:30. For those part-time students, are you working at home? No need to go back to office? No. Are you working for the housing department?
Sorry.
Oh, I'm asking you why Ying. He said that he's not working from home. He's a part-time student. Commercial building. I'm working from home and hope that my internet connection is stable. I try not go to the CityU campus. We wait for 2 more minutes and we'll begin. There are a lot of materials for this lecture because we have 3 topics: universal design, aging in place, and non-profit housing management. Okay, we'll begin. Today we talk about a lecture with different topics. Needs of special groups. For example, housing for elderly, people with special needs, and then we have another topic, third sector housing and non-profit management. First, we talk about universal design. Let's look at this picture. This person, this disabled person, need to press the button to call somebody to help him. Reach the bell first, then wait for someone to help. Is this accessibility? What do you think? Is it accessibility? What do you think? Tell me through chat. Yes, why? Somebody will help to get him through. Yes, but not user-friendly. Yes, not user-friendly. Is it fully accessible? You need to call somebody to help. The design of the building is not fully accessible. You need somebody to help. And very often, this may lead to a barrier. He may be ashamed or think that it is causing too much trouble and try not to ask somebody to help and try to avoid to go to this building. The design can be more user-friendly, can make it more accessible, and no need for others to help. How about this design? Is it more accessible? More user-friendly? Even disabled person can use without asking somebody to help? What do you think? Yes, much better. This is more accessible. The design is built in some facilities to help the disabled to use without asking somebody to help, not waiting others to help. And these are more accessible. There's a slope for this disabled person, those with a wheelchair to use. And this picture is taken in a public housing estate in Hong Kong with slope for disabled people. Not only design, there need to be management to really create a barrier-free access, inclusion, and non-discrimination. For example, the MTR station, you need somebody to handle the facilities for the people with a wheelchair. And for the bus, you need the bus driver to turn over the slope so that the wheelchair can enter the bus. And MTR station, you need to have a plate for the wheelchair to cross over. And sometimes the building is not designed to be accessible for those using wheelchair, but the management can have some kind of addition framework, addition slope to make it more accessible. This requires management. Social definitions and concepts of disability. The concept was disability shift from the medical model to social model. What is medical model? The medical model views disability as a feature in the person. The person has some inadequacy. That's why it cannot use the facility. It is a medical model, but now it has changed to the social model. It feels disability resulting from the interaction of people with the environment. It is the environment that disables certain people. It is not just a built-in handicap within the person. The social model recognizes that environmental factors can enable or disable the person. Not only the person has a disability, but the environment have an effect. Is it enabling even those with a disability to use the facility? It is a challenge for designers and housing managers to enable the environment to allow all users to use it. It needs the designers and the housing managers to serve with a heart. Very often it is difficult to really understand the disabled person, but we have to view it from the disabled person's perspective. If we cannot really do so, we consult the views of the users with special needs so that we understand their needs. Universal design. What does this concept mean? It is the design of products, environment, and programs and services to be usable for all by all people with the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation and specialized design. It is a design for all people, regardless of age, ability, and status in life. This universal design concept has growing importance. There are other terms, for example, barrier-free design, accessible design. But these two concepts, barrier-free design, accessible design, is related to the issues of mobility. There are other concepts which are related: inclusive design, design for all, universal design. It is a more comprehensive conception. It is more comprehensive than just focus on mobility. It emphasizes the enabling effect, enabler concept. Universal design, there are 7 principles. Equitable use. It can be used by all. Flexible in use. It can be flexibly used by all users. Simple and intuitive use. It is easy to understand how to use it. Perceptible information. The information is easy to understand. Tolerance of error. For example, sometimes a wheelchair may not move strictly. Does it tolerate some kind of error, or the wheelchair not moving in a strict way? Does the slope allow enough space for the wheelchair to move? Sometimes not in a strict way. Is it wide enough? No physical effort. Is the gradient of the slope too steep so that it is requiring great effort? Space and size and space for approach and use. Is the door wide enough for the wheelchair? Universal home. It is less based on high-tech advantages, but based on more knowledge of how people at different stages of life function, and how it helps self-care and human connections. For example, if the door is wide enough for people with a wheelchair to move in and out, it can facilitate human connection. They can move in and out to meet friends and people, and have self-care, and can reach self-care because they can go in and out to buy things. Livable homes with universal design. It addresses needs and requirements of all users regardless of size, age, and conditions. What are the conditions? These conditions may include sight, hearing, cognitive, and physical ability. These livable homes with universal design make possible and safer for all in all practical day-to-day tasks involving in living. There are different levels regarding to universal home. The housing unit, for example, is the button for the lights at appropriate level so that all people can reach it. Even those sitting on the wheelchair can reach it. The building, is there steps at the front of the building? The neighborhood. How about crossing the street in the neighborhood? Is it easy for those with a wheelchair? Some of the barriers in everyday life maybe include unsuitable bathing facilities. For example, a bathtub may be not suitable for elderly. They have difficulty stepping into the bathtub. A step at the door may be difficult for the elders and those using the wheelchair. The sidewalk too narrow may be not suitable for those using a wheelchair. And universal home design, some of the features may include minimize interior load-bearing walls so as to allow flexibility to remove the interior walls as to allow more space in the housing unit. For example, allow the movement of the wheelchair within the home. Stepless entrance so as to facilitate easy entrance of those on the wheelchair and the elderly. Bathing fixtures that allow multiple bathing options. For example, a shower may be suitable for all those people, including the elders and those on the wheelchair. They don't need to step into the bathtub. It may be difficult for them. Opportunities for safe recreation and transport choices. Transport choices, can those on the wheelchair use the bus, use the MTR? Universal design, and now the building and the design of the housing unit not only considers safety and energy efficiency, but universal usability become the norm. This enhance integration, participation, and enhancement of all people. It includes the concept of inclusion of all, not discriminating some kind of people so that they cannot use it. And this is equality. Allow all people to use. Everybody have equal access to the building. Now we watch a video.
越嚟越多地方都設有無障礙設施，對殘疾人士、長者以至推嬰兒車嘅市民都帶嚟方便。不過，無障礙設施之間嘅連接，點樣改建舊設施，點樣設計整個運輸配套等等，並唔係個別部門能夠自行處理。呢一日，患有弱視嘅世傑前往石硤尾南山村探望行動不便、需要使用輪椅嘅朋友長仔。佢哋沿住地上嘅引導徑， 準備去屋邨裏邊嘅診所覆診。
以前引路徑咧就係每個部門做翻自己嘅地方啦，部門協調得唔好嘅，當視障朋友離開屋邨嘅時候，想揾翻引路徑咧，我哋就往往好難揾到，咁就會有迷途咁嘅感受啦。而家我見引路徑大家分開咗嗰個機會率咧，真係細咗好多嘅。
我哋屋邨嘅設施咧，就有包括引路徑啦、斜台啦、扶手啊咁等等，咁啊方便啲傷健嘅朋友咧去到我哋屋邨啊不同嘅設施，譬如咧行人天橋啊、巴士站啊等等咁樣，咁都係方便晒大家。
佢哋抵達後唔使推門，已經可以直接進入診所。診所內登記處嘅高度同埋設計都考慮到使用輪椅人士嘅需要。西傑同埋長仔經過寬敞嘅通道，就可以喺等候區等候。顯示屏幕使用較大嘅字體顯示輪候情況。
咁我哋喺開工之前咧，就約見咗啲殘障人士團體，徵詢咗用家嘅意見。當中我哋包括咧就係話詢問處嘅櫃台嘅高度，我哋亦都改善咗啦。後邊我啲應診室、我啲號碼牌，我哋亦都同佢傾過之後，就提供多幾個角度，等啲視障嘅朋友咧可以睇得清楚啲。
西傑同埋長仔離開診所之後，利用屋邨裏邊嘅無障礙通道，去到屋邨附近嘅巴士站搭車。巴士有輪椅斜板，讓輪椅使用者可以輕易上落。
其實我哋而家巴士總站咧，除咗有一啲係俾視障人士使用嘅一啲凹凸紋警示帶之外，同埋一啲俾輪椅人士使用嘅下斜路沿咧。咁其實我哋喺巴士站較前嘅位置咧，我哋都加裝咗一啲輪椅標誌嘅記號嘅，咁就讓啲有需要嘅人士咧可以優先咁得到服務。
西傑同埋長仔坐巴士抵達尖沙咀碼頭。
一級樓梯啦，或者一個扶手咧，對於普通市民嚟講係一件好簡單嘅事，係微不足道。如果樓梯變成一條斜路咧，對於殘疾人士嘅出入啦，當然係方便好多。喺興建無障礙設施之前，各個政府部門唔應該各自為政。如果呢啲設施咧可以配合到殘疾人士嘅需要，香港可以達到國際大都會呢個水平。
由勞工及福利局牽頭，成立咗一個跨部門專責小組，成員包括建築署、房屋署、運輸署及路政署，以及各負責管理場地嘅部門。政府會為3500個政府場地同埋設施進行改善工程，以回應平等機會委員會就改善公眾可以無障礙地進出呢啲場所嘅建議。截至2012年6月，已完成90%。其餘嘅工程亦都會喺2014年6月完成。
我哋希望咧，唔單止喺硬件方面咧，去提升政府場地嘅無障礙設施，我哋都希望喺軟件方面，特別喺日常管理方面咧，都去改變同時嘅管理嘅文化。所以咧，我哋喺每個場地咧，都設立一個無障礙主任，以便咧可以好迅速咁樣回應市民嘅投訴同埋一啲建議。唔單止係咁咧。我哋喺每個部門、每個局咧，都設立一個無障礙統籌經理，去協調喺部門裏邊同埋部門同部門之間嘅工作。
場地嘅無障礙主任會確保有需要人士能夠順利使用相關設施。
咁我哋希望呢啲設施咧能夠人人都用得到，傷健朋友用得到，個個都用得到，咁啊大家開心。
要提供合適嘅無障礙設施，各個部門積極諮詢殘疾人士團體，又邀請殘疾人士現身說法，確切了解使用者嘅真正需要，令佢哋可以同其他市民一樣，可以暢通無阻咁使用設施或服務。
我哋希望透過我哋呢個行動，可以產生漣漪效應，去推動其他公營嘅機構以及私人嘅公司，同我哋攜手合作，一同為香港打造一個無障礙嘅城市。
Okay, a barrier-free society needs the government to take the lead, and there needs to be interdepartmental collaboration, and it also needs to serve the community with a heart and feel the need from the perspective of the disabled people. Okay, besides the disabled people, the elderly need special attention. And many of the elderly, they also use a wheelchair, and they also need a barrier-free access society. We talk about housing for the elder. The population pyramid of Hong Kong in 1971, it is like a pyramid. Those at the younger age, the number of people at the younger age are greater, and those at the older age are smaller. It's like a pyramid. In 1926, it likes a reverse pyramid. Those younger age, the number of people is smaller. Those of the older age, 60 to 64, greater in number. And then those at even greater age, smaller number, but greater as compared to the past, because people live longer, and many of them can have good health even at old age. And then maybe at present time, those bulk may move up, and as people are aging. The concept of aging in place is a process where the older adults continue to live in their own homes. They don't need to move to the elderly home, don't need to be taken care by nurse and the caring staff. They stay in the home as they grow old without relocating to assisted living facility like elderly home, and served and cared by skilled nursing facility. Aging in place is the prevailing way of people growing old. 居家安老啦。Most older people prefer to remain in the living environment, living in their home as they grow old, instead of moving to elderly home. What are the considerations for aging in place? Why is aging in place welcomed by the elders? First is the financial considerations. Many of the people may be homeowners. In Hong Kong, about half of the household are living in home ownership homes. They own their own homes. They are homeowners, and many of them have cleared all the mortgages by old age. And they have financially invested in their home, and they would like to stay in their home. They have to pay all the mortgage, and it is rent-free. And aging in place, 居家安老 can make the elders stay in connection with their social network, live in the familiar environment, familiar community, live with their adult children or live near their adult children, and they are familiar with the neighbors, and they go to the familiar doctors and the shopping areas. The whole environment is familiar with the elders is familiar with the whole environment, and there's a psychological attachment. They have lived in the home throughout their whole life, and they have a memory connected to the home, and they have a sense of belonging. It is part of their personal identity. And there's a sense of belonging to the home. They do not want to move to the elderly home unless it is really necessary. If aging in place is preferred by the elders, what are the facilitation that can help them to stay in their own home? This is an elderly home in Tanner Hill of the housing society. The bathroom is specially designed. There's no bathtub, and this is flat. You can walk in to take a shower easily, and there's grab bars and handle so that it is easier for elders to stay in the home. And in the elderly housing, there are certain facilities. For example, occupational and physiotherapy facilities. And not only the house design has certain facilities to facilitate aging in place, furniture also help. This is part of the bed. This can be pulled out and turned into a chair so that it facilitates the carer to care for the elders, and the elders can stay at home. And in the elderly housing, there are special bell that the elders can press in case of an emergency. And the housing society has a elderly resource center that displays certain facilities that can be set up in the elderly home, in the elders' home, so that it can facilitate aging in place. One of this is a chair that can be moved, turn around 360 degrees, so that the carer can help the elders to take a shower. And the whole toilet the floor is flat and slanting slightly towards the drain, so that it is easier for the elders to take a shower. No need to step into the bathtub to take a bath. And there's grab bars. Aging in place, any facilitation, informal care given provided by family, friends and neighbors help aging in place. Informal care, especially elder children who live with the elders or who live near the elders so as to provide care. Friends and neighbors may help the elders to age in place. And in-home and personal care provided by professionals. For example, some community service center have home delivered meals and have some workers to help to transport or escort their elders to see a doctor. And there needs to be home modifications, for example, removing hazards and add an expensive device, for example, grab bars, so as to help the elders to stand up or to sit down. Elderly center providing elderly services, social services for elders within the neighborhood. All these help aging in place, facilitate aging in place. Reverse mortgage, it also helps to finance home modifications and pay for in-home care, provide some kind of financial sources for the elders to age in place. There needs to be broader strategies. For example, some accessibility features in the construction of homes and the buildings. For example, single step entrance to the buildings or to the home, and wide doorways so as to allow the moving of the wheelchair and elders. When they become very old, they usually need a wheelchair, and wider elder-friendly community. To have infrastructure, is it easy to cross the road with a wheelchair, and whether healthcare services is provided in the neighborhood so that the elders can get healthcare services when in need. And community care of older people is also needed, whether the general public respect the elders and willing to give a helping hand. Do you allow the elders to have a seat in the MTR or on the bus? And whether the neighbors are willing to help those elders. It needs appropriate home design, community care, and a supportive community, whether the community respect the elders and willing to give a helping hand. What are the challenges of aging in place? Aging in place may need good health condition of the elders, but in Hong Kong, the health conditions of elders are deteriorating rapidly in the past 2 decades, mainly because the elders have lived longer, and elders of older age may have poorer health. And the Chinese virtues of respecting the old, care for the old may be deteriorating in Hong Kong society. And the spirit of mutual help may be diminishing. In the past, neighbors are in close connection and they take care of each other and give mutual help. But nowadays in Hong Kong, you may not know the next door neighbor's surname, and maybe you do not meet your neighbors, and you do not know the occupation of the neighbors. The mutual help and the neighbors' relations are diminishing, and many elders are staying alone. Some of the elders couples, they stay in one housing unit, and if one of the partner pass away, the elders stay alone, and they may lack companion and lack support. And the alternative may be institutional care, move to elderly home, but it is very expensive to live in private elderly home, and the subsidized elderly home, you need to wait a long time in Hong Kong, and it is inadequately available. We have talked about universal design and aging in place. What is the relation between aging in place and universal design? You can tell me through chat. What are the relations, possible relations between universal design and aging in place? Any idea? You can tell me through chat. Any idea about the relations between universal design and aging in place? Does universal design help aging in place, facilitate aging in place? Any idea? Consider the accessibilities of elders. Yes, universal design considered accessibility, and it helps aging in place. And elders sometimes have a disability as they age. And universal design allows those with a disability and allows people of all age to use. And universal design can facilitate aging in place. Yes, good. Aging in place, what are the policies that facilitate aging in place? In Hong Kong before 1980s, there's no special public housing policy for the elderly because the population in Hong Kong in the past are young population. As we read from the population pyramid, there are a lot of young people in the past in 1971. PRH, public rental housing, is provided for elderly on priority basis now. And there are a lot of priority scheme for elders, senior elderly persons priority scheme, elderly persons priority scheme, harmonious families priority scheme. Now, the public rental housing take care of the elders and put them on a priority when allocating public rental housing. In 2015 policy address of Hong Kong, it emphasized the importance of aging in place and consider aging in place as a special concept in designing and planning elderly housing. The concept of universal design was introduced into public housing design so that it helps public housing to fit people of all age, size, and ability. Since 2000, the government incorporates certain facilities and particular elements of housing design in public housing redevelopment, so that the housing design is in line with aging in place. And they have the universal design in public rental housing. What are the design elements and facilities in public rental housing estate? At the micro level, interior design, especially the bathroom. There's the non-slip flooring, the grab bars, the living area, the interior design of the PRH housing unit. There's increased door width, shallow entrance door, threshold, larger light switch, light switches at convenient height. At the meso level, the estate, the housing unit is the micro scale. The meso level, the meso scale, the estate. There are a lot of gathering areas and seats for others to sit around to chat and socialize. The signage, barrier-free access routes, connect domestic blocks to major estate facilities. The macro level, the community level, there's the community care services, there's elderly services center, there's personal care. For example, the provision of meals to the elderly housing unit, elders housing unit, and escort to have medical consultation and health care and prevention care and transport facilities to care. there's convenient transport so that they can go to have medical consultation. Aging in place, besides the public housing sector, the third sector efforts. First sector is the non-profit sector. We talk about third sector housing in the latter part of the lecture. Third sector is the non-profit sector. What are the non-profit sector's efforts in aging in place? The Hong Kong Housing Society is a non-profit organization. It issued the Universal Design Guidebook in 2005. And it suggests guidelines for professionals, for example, architects, to design elderly-friendly housing unit so that the interior design are user-friendly to the elders. In 2003, the government waived the land premium for the housing society to develop senior citizen residence scheme. These are elderly housing. It has a long lease arrangement where the elders pay a lump sum, and then they can live in the elderly housing, and the elderly housing has self-contained domestic units with universal design. It provides different kinds of services: social service, recreational service, and personal care services. They have a security of lease for life. They can live until they pass away. And there are holistic care of the needs of the elderly residents. There are different types of care services: social, recreational, and personal care services provided in the elderly housing. How about in the private sector, private housing sector? How is aging in place? In the old private housing in Hong Kong, they face urban redevelopment. And when there's urban redevelopment, elders are the ones who suffer most. They need to move to a new environment, and relocation, because of redevelopment, is uneasy for the elders. It creates stress for the elders and may affect the psychological health because they need to adapt to a new environment. And very often, they may also need to move to another district and break away from the social network. When there's redevelopment, they move involuntarily. They are deprived of the support social networks, move away from the neighbors that they are familiar with. And with the limited budgets, these elders, their choice of residence may be restricted. There may be downward filtering, and they need to move to housing of lower price and maybe of a lower quality. And leading developers in Hong Kong explicitly mentioned that the provision of housing for the elders is not their plans. And usually the provision of private housing is aimed at young people or young families. There's the provision of nano flats in Hong Kong, and usually young people live in nano flat. These nano flats aim at young people rather than the elders. While some do not even want to comment on the issue, some of the private developers, they may not be interested in providing elderly housing for the elders. There's an example in the private sector that provide integrated service apartment for elders in the private sector. We look at their website. I share the screen. A silver lining for the silver age for the elders. Two groups' unique expertise in elderly care and hospitality to create first of its kind project run by the private sector. There are elderly housing provided in the private sector, and the first of its kind is provided by two groups. One group specialized in elderly care and one group specialized in hospitality. What kind of services are provided in this private service apartment for the elders? Medical support, 24-hour professional nursing care and instant home care support, medical assessment, regular home visit for health checkup, healthy support, life support, register occupational therapists and physiotherapists. And there are elderly care escort services to have medical follow-up, personal nursing care services, for example, feeding and bathing. Some kind of social activities, recreation activities, senior school, and counseling services. And other services, for example, an emergency call bell, motion sensor, bathroom handrails, emergency response in case of accidents, cleaning, laundry services, concierge, 24-hour security services. This is one of the private sector elderly housing example. Okay, we have talked about universal design. We have talked about aging in place, elderly housing. We talk about non-profit management and third sector housing in the latter part of the lecture. Now we have a 10 minutes break. No, 5 minutes break. Come back at 7:25 and we'll continue. Okay, we continue. We talk about non-profit management and third sector housing. Third sector is the non-profit sector. Non-profit or third sector housing. What are the characteristics of third sector? And the third sector carry out charitable and philanthropic and or voluntary activities. It try to do good, do voluntary services, charitable services in the public organized form. It is different from you helping your neighbor to buy salt. You helping your neighbor to buy salt. It's not a public organized form. It is in public organized form, and there's self-governance structures. For example, in Hong Kong, we have Tonghua Group, POL5703, did that kind of third sector organization. They have self-governing structures. For societal rather than profit-making goals, they are not for making a profit, but for societal good. The third sector may also be called the non-profit sector or the voluntary sector or the independent sector. And third sector housing is housing services provided by the third sector. Some of the non-profit or third sector housing is housing developed by religious organizations or other NGOs, especially in overseas examples. For seniors or those with special needs. Some of the overseas example may be those mental health associations. They try to provide supportive housing for clients with mental health. Or those religious organizations, they redevelop the land so as to provide housing for particular needy group, or and also provide worship place for their religious organization. Examples of third sector housing in Hong Kong. The third sector provide PRH, public rental housing waiting list household, transitional housing 過渡性房屋 to alleviate the plight when they are waiting for PRH. The community housing movement of the Hong Kong Council of Services 社聯啦 provide transitional housing for PRH, public rental housing waiting list household, by using underutilized housing to provide transitional housing. For example, they utilize urban renewal authorities flats or flats awaiting redevelopment by public developers. The Hong Kong Council of Social Services 社聯 also developed modular housing to provide transitional housing for those PRH waiting list household. Modular housing 組合屋啦。Another example of third sector housing in Hong Kong, 光房 light rooms. With benevolent landlords 良心小業主 renting out properties at below market rent to low-income single-parent families, managed and operated by third sector housing organization, and it is Light B, the third sector organization 要有光啦。They try to match transitional housing for single-parent families. We know what is non-profit third sector housing. We now look at what is non-profit management, with special attention to non-profit governance, financial management, and human resources management. The governance for non-profit organization, they have a board that make policy decisions, and the staff usually headed by the CEO to implement the policy decision. Every nonprofit has a governing board, and the governing board ensures that the organization is using its resources appropriately. and it is using the resources to pursue the mission of the organization, and also sustain public confidence in the nonprofit organization, so that people may donate money and resources to the nonprofit organization. And it is required by law to have a governing board. But the governing board may not be as effective as it should be, and we'll look at it later on. Non-profit governance, we look at the corporate governance of Hong Kong Housing Society, a non-profit housing society, housing organization in Hong Kong. This is the corporate governance of Hong Kong Housing Society. There's a supervisory board, and there's an executive committee. This executive committee is headed by the CEO, and there are members under the CEO. The supervisory board, with a maximum of 25 members, is responsible for the formulation of housing society's mission and guiding principles. Members of the supervisory board and committees contribute to housing society on voluntary basis. That means they are not paid staff. They work on voluntary basis, and they decide the mission and the guiding principles of the housing society. And the CEO is the paid staff to carry out the decision made by the supervisory board. Then we look at the non-profit governance of Light B 要有光啦, providing light homes and light housing, 光房光屋. Light B 要有光, there's a governing team, and there are members. The executive team carry out the decision of the governing team. Notice that Ricky Yu exists in the executive team, and he also is present in the governing team. Because he's the founder of Light B, and he is present in the governing team and the executive team. The governing board's basic responsibility is to translate the mission statement into programs. Non-profit organization, third sector housing organization has a mission statement. We look at some of the examples later. They try to translate the mission into programs, but they are changing needs of the society, and the governing board needs to reconsider how the organization has been carrying out its program, whether it serves the present needs. Maybe it have served the past needs, but is it adapting to the changing society, and it needs to look for better ways to serve its basic purpose and mission. There's a basic mission statement of every non-profit organization or third sector organization. The mission statement states the purpose of the organization and the reason for it to exist. It tries to identify the ends, but it not explain the means. Some of the example of mission statement, the Hong Kong Housing Society. The vision is to be a world-class housing solution provider It provides housing solution and an innovator with leadership in quality, value for money, and management. This is the vision of housing society. The mission is that it is a non-government organization with a social conscience. It serves the needs of Hong Kong community. It has the target group, the Hong Kong community, not other places, in housing and related services. Light B, Yu Yao Guang has its mission statement. Light B's mission is not simply to provide housing, but more importantly, to give them temporarily impoverished household a chance to rebuild their upward mobility. It tries to use housing as a means to promote upward mobility. We innovate, we foster upward mobility, we improve social housing. We are a new form of grassroots community. This is the mission statement of Light B. The board and the CEO, the governing board are usually part-time amateurs. As stated in the housing society's governance framework, those on the governing board are working on voluntary basis. They are not paid staff, but the paid staff and the CEO are full-time professionals. If the board, the governing board is large, it may have a difficulty, a special difficulty in challenging the CEO. The CEO are full-time staff. Individual board members may be unwilling to risk embarrassment to challenge the CEO. The CEO have information and is working full-time, and he can also control the agenda. And the governing board may not be working very effectively over the control over the paid staff and the CEO. And if the board is big, the individual board members may feel embarrassed when challenged the CEO. The CEO control the access of information, and they develop the agenda, which the board considers. The board may not be meeting its responsibility fully because they are part-time and they are amateurs, and they're working on voluntary basis. They cannot keep a close watch of those full-time staff. The boards are to maintain and develop policy in 4 areas. It defines the ends to be achieved by the non-profit organization. It have the means statement. It states the limitations that the executive can use, the means, the ways that the executive can use to achieve the ends. For example, they may limit the profit oriented activities of the paid staff. Board staff relation. It tells about the responsibility of the board and the CEO, what lies in the responsibility of the board and what lies in the responsibility of the CEO. And it also states the process of governance. For example, how new board members are to be included, to be elected. Non-profit financial management. One of the special features of non-profit third sector organization is that they can have fundraising through donation. The organization is doing something that one believes in, and you also trust the organization. That's why you donate money to the organization. And there may be repeated donors to an organization. For example, you donate money on a monthly basis to the organization. And the organization may target prospective donors. For example, they may send letters to certain donors for repeated donation. And they may research on what are the prospective donors. For example, they target those middle-class housing. They send a letter to all persons living in the middle-class housing estate for donation. Besides money, there can be in-kind donation, donation of space, food, and non-monetary goods. For example, restaurant provide food for fundraising event, and professional provide free services for third sector organization. Donations for third sector housing. There can be in-kind donation. For example, land and housing resources. Housing units are rented by benevolent landlord 良心小業主 as below market rent levels to the needy. Some of these housing units are idle and underutilized. They are left idle, and the landlord may do some kind of charity. They rent it at below market rent. Some may be property requests to descendants. They do not want to sell it. Maybe they do some kind of charity with a housing unit, or even purposely purchase for philanthropic purposes. Some of the donations of third sector housing in Hong Kong, for example, Sun Hong Gay Properties donate landlord Li Yuanlong to Sing Kong Hui for multi-services building, which include youth hostel, which will be rented at 60% market rent. And Henderson Land rents a land lot at $1 to Hong Kong Council of Social Services to build modular housing. And New World Property donate land to Light B to build Light Village for a token sum of $1. Besides land and housing resources, there can be money donation. Light B received 22 million for light housing projects from Zhou Daifeng Charity Foundation. And Hong Kong Council of Social Services received 50 million from community chests. And Hong Kong Council of Social Services are also partially funded by community chests to establish the intermediate platform for community housing. Besides in-kind donation, land and housing resources, there can be money donation for third sector housing. Besides donation, third sector housing also receive government support. Non-profit and third sector services can be a supplementary to government. They fill in the gaps left by the government programs. For example, the government do not provide specialized housing for those ex-prisoners, but the ex-prisoners find it difficult to rent housing to live because of some kind of discrimination on the part of landlord. And some of the NGO, they provide third sector housing to ex-prisoners. This addresses public purposes and it supplements government, fill in the gap left by the government. Third sector can also be complementary to the government. The non-profit organization work with the government. They use government funds to provide goods and services that government decides. For example, the third sector organization are providing transitional housing for those public rental housing waiting list household, and it complements the government. The government cannot provide public rental housing to all those on the waiting list. And in order to alleviate the housing plight of those on the waiting list, the non-profit organization, the third sector organization, provide third sector housing, transitional housing to those on the waiting list. And they serve as partners with the government. Government support of third sector housing in Hong Kong. The support may not be just in the form of money. There can be non-financial policy facilitation. For example, in Hong Kong, there's the setting up of the special unit within the Office of Chief Secretary for Administration to facilitate light housing projects. They set up a unit to facilitate the project. There are other government support of third sector housing, financial support. For example, the government leased out former factory quarters to Lighthouse for a period of 6 years at $1 symbolic rent. This is a kind of financial support, and partial funding through the SIE Development Fund, Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship Development Fund. For the Council of Social Service, for the setting up of the Council of Social Service Office for Community Housing Movement to support a few staff to run the project. And there are more concrete and noteworthy government sponsorship in 218. The government provide subsidy for the building of modular housing under the Community Care Fund. In the policy address of Hong Kong 2021, it says that the Transport and Housing Bureau identifies sufficient land to provide targeted 15,000 units of transitional housing, the running of transitional housing. This paragraph talks about transitional housing. As original pledged. And now it proposed to increase the overall supply of transitional housing to 20,000 units in the coming years by providing 5,000 additional units and increasing the amount of funding to 11.6 billion. That means the government facilitates third sector housing, transitional housing, by identifying sufficient land and set up a target number of units for transitional housing, and it also provides funding for transitional housing. Okay, besides finance, how about managing people, employees, and volunteers? This sector organizations are different because there are volunteers working for them besides paid staff. One of the special characteristics of non-profit organizations is a high labor intensity. Usually they provide services to the needy, and it requires a lot of labor. And in US, the labor costs form up to 44% of the total expense, the labor payments of the non-profit. Non-profit, in fact, pay less than for-profit counterparts. For example, in the US, the for-profit sector has 20% wage advantage over his or her non-profit counterpart. The for-profit organizations pays better than the non-profit organizations. But the non-profit organizations is dependent on high-quality staff, but they can only manage to pay less. How can they continue to attract staff under these circumstances? those working for non-profit organizations, they are trading off salary for working conditions. They may accept lower pay, but their working conditions are more favorable. The wage differential represents that the non-profit workers are willing to donate part of their wages to the organization because they support the mission. Because they find that working in the organization are meaningful, they may be willing to accept lower wages. The implication of accepting lower wages is that the status of the staff as stakeholders increases, and the importance of involving staff. Because they accept lower wages, their stake in the organization is higher as compared to the non-profit organization and as compared to the for-profit organization. The staff have more chance to involve in decision making. In this sense, it motivates the staff to work well for the non-profit organization. And the for-profit and the non-profit organization use different tools to motivate and control staff. The for-profit organization, they give them monetary pay to motivate them and control them. But for the non-profit organization, they give more flexibility in work, more decision-making chances for the non-profit staff, non-profit organization staff. Besides staff, there's also the formal volunteer policy for non-profit organization. There are volunteers working as part of the organization. There's volunteer policy. They state out the expectations of the volunteer and tell the mechanism to evaluate the volunteers and how and in what circumstances they can terminate the volunteer status. The volunteer policy also tells the relation between the volunteers and the paid staff, by whom the volunteers are supervised and whom they can supervise. If there's no clear volunteer policy, there may be misunderstanding, and there may be also legal problems. And volunteer policy is needed for risk management. For human resources related to third sector organization, Ricky Yu, as I talk about the governing structure of Light B, Ricky Yu is presented as present in the governing board and in the paid staff of Light B. Ricky Yu is the founder of Light B, and he resigned from his well-paid job in an international company to work for light rooms and light housing projects. He quit his well-paid job to work in Light B and to help those needy to have decent housing, to provide light rooms and light housing. Light B also involve volunteers. There are architects that offer volunteer services to Light B light housing project. Hong Kong Council of Social Service 社聯 teams up with a number of professional bodies, including Law Society, Institute of Architects, Institution of Engineers, Institute of Surveyors. All these professional bodies provide professional advice to Council of Social Service to implement the social housing project. And not only professionals, some laymen can be volunteers. Good housing, 好宅, is another third sector housing project. It involves volunteers for moving homes, small-scale repairs and renovation, and help household appliances repair. All these involve laymen, common citizens like you and me, helping as a volunteer for these third sector housing projects. Third sector housing organization is different from for-profit organizations. There may be volunteers working for these third sector organizations because they think that third sector organizations are doing something good for society. They are willing to provide services on voluntary basis. Now we watch a video on Light B, on light housing provided by Light B.
This half-century-old building on the hillside at Shamjiang used to be Kowloon Textile Family Dormitory. It was left to gather dust after the closure of the factory in 1997.
點解即係有人冇屋住會有屋冇人住嘅咧？咁所以就好想試下可唔可以攞嚟做一啲類似我哋做開嘅光房嘅服務。
Light B is the name of the social enterprise Ricky Yu founded in 2010. Using the word light as the theme, he launched his first project, Light Home, which was designed to provide grassroots families with homes at affordable rental. He's now planning to get this old building back in shape for his next project, Light Housing.
「光屋」嘅意思咧係代表一種新嘅開始。換句話講，街坊搬到嚟呢度咧，唔係純粹租一間屋住，而係喺呢度展開一個新嘅生活。
The old Kowloon Textile Family Dormitory is a 5-story building with 45 units. After the factory closed, the building owner decided to call it quits as well, letting the government reclaim the land, and the building remained empty.
而家就做緊個外牆工程，我哋係個外牆工程係同裏邊裝修一齊做噶嘛，係咪？
In 2014, Ricky Yu applied to the Lands Department for a lease of the land for social housing purposes. He also applied to the Town Planning Board for permission to transform the old dormitory into a residential building.
因為你知我哋棟樓就唔係純粹商業噶嘛，係啊。呢個去水位就咁流落外牆，定係有條喉嘅咧？會有條喉嘅。但係呢度佢會伸條喉入嚟收水咯喎。係啊。哦。
At the end of last year, Ricky Yu was given the green light to begin his new project, Shamjiang Light Housing.
你見到天台你唔做防漏就咁樣咯，見到啊？係一大幅石屎跌落嚟，如果有人住就係砸穿頭㗎啦。沙廠結業之後，咁變咗啲屋咧，其實冇人打理。 咁佢就一路老化，一路惡化。咁我哋就要將剩餘未剝落嚟嘅石屎咧，就全部整甩晒佢。然之後咧，將啲生鏽鋼筋做翻晒防鏽，然之後再補翻個天花。另外一種就係將無論係水喉啦、電線啦，都重新鋪設過。希望另外用多半年至9個月時間嚟翻新呢個工程。咁我覺得而家我會覺得係即係而家係10月懷胎，個 BB 準備出世啦。 咁一出世之後咧，你可以想像呢度就會有個新嘅社區喺呢度出現。
Growing up in a housing estate, Ricky Yu has first-hand knowledge of the poor conditions in which grassroots families live. In 2010, he decided to resign from a well-paying job in an international company and dedicate himself to running a social enterprise instead.
咁香港嘅特色就係冇地方就講乜都係揀，俾少少錢基層街坊，你俾得幾多？長貧難顧，佢哋唔係需要我哋啲錢啊，而係你需要俾個空間佢，俾條路佢行下。咁我哋就嘗試俾條路佢行下咯。
The goal of Light Housing Project is to provide single mothers in need with decent, affordable housing so they can live with the dignity they deserve. It's a system of subletting that depends on whether or not there are landlords who are willing to rent their properties relatively cheaply to Light B in the first place.
好多時貧窮，大家就諗銀包冇錢，但其實我哋睇貧窮好多時係嗰種，唉，我都係唔得㗎啦，我唔識做嘅呢樣嘢。 嗰種咁樣嘅面對唔到困難嗰種心態係貧窮嘅根源，但係我哋嘅同事就會幫啲街坊諗下自己將來可以點生活落去，幫佢哋定具體嘅目標，有需嘅時候介紹唔同嘅資源俾佢，以至到佢可以由開頭我哋扶佢一陣，但係好快佢就自己行落去。
半夜起身落黑雨要成個窗咧壓晒水咯，成張牆濕晒咯。
Quan, a single mother, lived in this subdivided room with her son Fufu for over a year.
今日就11月1號啦，我呢邊嘅租約就到期㗎啦。應該一陣間9點到11點鐘到啦，咁就會有搬屋公司上嚟幫我搬屋啦。咁你入去睇一睇嗰啲嘢咧，都成點先？小心啊 ！OK。家姐。 食飯要同呢度講拜拜。拜拜。閂門啦。唔捨得啦，君係嘛？係啊。
Thanks to the referral of a social worker, Quan and her son were able to become beneficiaries of Ricky Yu's Light Home project 2 years ago.
到啦，上嚟啊！係啦。
而家個感覺係點啊？
如果呢啲地方你打開個窗，你望到出邊個天，見到啲陽光，咁你覺得你真係一個正常人啲咯？你覺得你好似正常，唔係好似啲老鼠咁樣匿埋喺個洞嗰度嗰個心情咯。期望夫婦喺呢度開心成長啦，身體健康啦，咁啊係最大嘅期望。 跟住我轉個圈，咕隆咕隆咕隆咕隆。
Fufu is going to school now, and Quan is doing a part-time job. Life is as good as can be expected under the circumstances.
以前我哋都會係比較少煎炸，多數都係烚或者係蒸，咁簡單啲。咁因為個地方比較細啊。 以前我哋係唔單止係冇家嘅感覺，用啲簡單嘅字枱去食飯。因為我哋要用咗大部分嘅個錢去交租咧，就冇乜剩得好多嘅錢去買食物呢樣嘢。咁即係平均一日都係得可能50蚊，就放我哋2個一日3餐。咁就其實你都冇乜心情叫做坐低食飯㗎啦。 其實租金嗰度平咗1000幾蚊，係令到我呢一個月嘅生活嘅食嘅嗰個質素提高咗咯。而家係100蚊，甚至有陣時可以去到150蚊，咁你就會覺得有一個幸福感咯。Hello， 朱姑娘，朱姑娘嚟咗啊！朱姑娘。
The Light Home manager comes around every month to collect rent. While doing so, she makes a note of how the tenants are getting along with each other, and, if appropriate, tries to help them make plans for life after the 3-year light housing lease expires.
每個月要儲到幾多錢咧？你先至可以儲
夠呢？差唔多1個月應該可以儲到1000蚊嘅。1個月
1000蚊，
儲到嘅。貨儲錢嚟講真係辛苦嘅。當你咁辛苦去揾錢嗰陣時， 你使錢嗰陣時，你就會唔捨得去亂咁使㗎啦。所以成日都要控制自己。對於一個女人嚟講。
The Light Home project has got off to a promising start. Work on the old dormitory in Shamjiang is picking up steam as well.
因為我哋個圖係個廳係3個掣位嘅，係3個。嗰個係電視機位，係。咦？呢個係可以開3機鎖嘅。個工程而家你見到啦，我哋外牆已經搭好晒棚架。原本嗰啲剝落嘅天花啊、石屎啊、牆身，我哋已經重新批盪，部分單位油過油。咁即係你已經感受到呢個似一個可以住人嘅地方。即係如果你之前你話係壞開嘅話咧，而家係作動就嚟生得㗎啦。咁所以心情都係好緊張、好興奮嘅。
咁變咗呢個係 pantry 咯，呢個
pantry 啦，同埋即係好簡單一個功能。
係。
Introduced to Ricky Yu 2 years ago, architect Ivan Fu is in complete agreement with the concept of light housing. He's volunteering his services.
咁呢度有2個房咧，其實我哋就會係做 common room 嘅，坐下聚住啲人嘅一個地方，就可能會搞一啲活動啊、workshop 啊。個鄰舍關係就會好好多。咁其實呢一樣嘢就係，如果相較今日嘅好多 gate community 嘅屋邨，佢可能個生活更好咧。
點樣可以將呢棟樓變成一個好似小村落式咁樣嘅生活？有啲咩嘢需要，唔使行出去村口買咁遠啦，可能問下隔離阿師奶，點樣用身邊嘅人脈啊、資源啊，互相幫助對方啊？呢啲往往我哋喺我哋經驗裏邊係俾一啲物質嘅嘢佢，更加幫到嗰個人改善將來嘅生活。
Okay, in the video we are introduced Ricky Yu, the founder of Lightbee, and there's also a volunteer and the architect working for the Light Housing project. Okay, a question for you to think about. Managing a non-profit organization is more difficult than managing a for-profit company. How far do you agree with this statement? Think about it and tell me through chat. What do you think? Is managing a non-profit organization more difficult? Yes, why? Obviously, yes, because of funding is difficult to source. Sometimes money cannot solve all the problems. If there are problems that cannot be solved by money, is it more difficult? Yes, people volunteer because they agree with your mission. They donate because they agree with your mission. How you get the trust from the volunteer, from the donors, is very important. How about others? Any views? Harder to keep talent because you do not pay well, is it true? Sometimes you work for a purpose, work for a mission, you can work harder than work for money. Okay, you have some ideas about nonprofit organization management. It is not easy. Okay, Mother Teresa, a Nobel, she gets a Nobel Prize on peace. Apply the following to nonprofit management and third sector housing development. God doesn't require us to succeed. He only requires that you try. Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. How about applying these two quotations from Mother Teresa to nonprofit management and third sector housing development? Tell me through chat. Any idea? Why light B is a good example. We need to explain. They don't know if they can succeed, but try. Do they have some success up to this stage? And the video is taken, I think, in 2016. Now it's 2022. Light housing has been implemented. How about others? Applying these quotations to nonprofit management and third sector housing development? Not all of us can do great things. We may not be as great as Ricky, you giving up the job in a high-paying international company, but we can do small things with great love. Can we be a volunteer? If we are busy when we are working, some of you are taking this course on part-time basis, you have a full-time job, but can you work as a volunteer when you retire? Especially you have housing management experience. Can you work as a volunteer when you retired or during your leisure time for third sector organization? We can do small things with great love. Modular housing is a small project, but still helps the lower class. Yes, we try to help those in need as far as possible, even though transitional housing may not be great in numbers, but it still help a certain number of people. It's better than none, better than without the transitional housing projects. It is a trial and error process. But the nonprofit organization can sense the needs of the society and try to respond to the needs of society, even though the users may not articulate their needs in advance. Okay, these are the readings and the reference if you need further reading for the lecture. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. If there's no problem, we end the lecture. Any problem? Any question? If no question, we end the lesson and you go to the tutorial. Half of the class will have tutorial today. Okay, bye-bye.